March 1945. The air along the Rhine was cold, wet, and heavy with smoke. Engineers moved in silence, boots sinking into river mud, hands numb as they locked steel plates and timber into place. Searchlights swept the far bank. German artillery could strike at any moment. Yet, the Americans worked faster. Like time itself was their weapon. What happened here would break the final barrier into Germany. Stay with me. This is history that mattered. To understand why German officers were stunned by American engineers at the Rhine, we first need to understand why bridges were not just structures, but strategic weapons. In the industrial warfare of the 20th century, the side that could move faster, supply faster, and reinforce faster gained not just advantage, they gained inevitability. World War II, more than any conflict before it, was a war of movement. Tanks, self-propelled guns, armored divisions, trucks, fuel convoys, ammunition columns. The entire war machine depended on roads and bridges. Break a bridge and you stop an army. Build one faster than the enemy expects, and you make their defenses meaningless. Germany understood this. So did the United States. By 1944, the German army was retreating across Europe, trying to buy time. Each river they crossed, they destroyed bridges behind them. Every blown span was meant to slow the Allies, forcing them to pause, reorganize, and rebuild, while German reinforcements dug in deeper on the next defensive line. The most important of all these barriers was the Rhine River, a wide, fast-moving natural wall running north to south across Germany. It was more than water. It was a defensive dream. If the Germans could make their last stand anywhere, it would be here. The river was deep, the current strong, the banks steep. The bridges were few, and destroying them could theoretically stop or delay an invading army for weeks. The German High Command believed that if the Allies reached the Rhine, they would face a choice: either halt and attempt risky river crossings, or slow down long enough for Germany to regroup. The war might not be won, but it could be prolonged. And time. Time was life. But America had prepared for this years earlier. Before the war, while Europe was still in uneasy peace, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers was developing a new idea of warfare: mobility through standardized engineering. Instead of treating every destroyed bridge as a unique construction problem requiring custom solutions, they created a system of modular, mass-produced bridge components. These could be treadway bridges, floating on pontoons, built fast for light or medium traffic. Bailey bridges, steel truss bridges assembled like giant metal erector sets. Heavy ponton bridges, for tanks and armored columns. Ferry rigs, assault boats, raft systems. The genius was not in inventing bridges. It was in inventing speed. Everything was pre-measured, pre-cut, interchangeable, designed to be assembled by ordinary soldiers. Not specialized builders, an engineer battalion could arrive at a river, unload parts from trucks, and assemble a bridge section by section while under fire. The result was astonishing. A bridge that normally took weeks could be thrown across a river in hours. Germany had never seen anything like this. Their engineering doctrine assumed construction under calm, prepared, methodical circumstances. The American approach assumed the opposite: chaos. And chaos was where they excelled. By early 1945, the Allies had crossed France, liberated Belgium, breached the Siegfried Line, and were pushing deep into Western Germany. German divisions were exhausted. Fuel was scarce. Ammunition was inconsistent. But the terrain and the Rhine still seemed to give Germany an advantage. And it did, on paper. American commanders knew that the final push into the heart of Germany would require not only strategy and firepower, but bridges faster than the Germans believed possible. The German army intended to destroy every crossing, turning the Rhine from a river into a wall. But the United States had one more advantage, one that the German High Command underestimated: the speed of American logistics. Behind every U.S. frontline unit were rolling repair shops, mobile sawmills, welding trucks, crane trucks, entire trains carrying replacement steel. Thousands of engineers pre-trained in river bridging. While German officers were taught to hold ground, American engineers were trained to keep the war moving. So when U.S. armored and infantry divisions reached the Rhine, the expectation on both sides was clear. The Germans would blow the bridges, and American forces would have to pause to rebuild. The Germans believed this pause would last days, maybe weeks. But they were wrong, because on the eastern bank of the Rhine, at a small town called Remagen, something happened that no German officer expected. One bridge survived, and the Americans reached it first. What they did next, how fast they acted, how relentlessly they built, reinforced, replaced, and expanded bridges under fire, would break the last defense of Germany. And it would leave German commanders asking the same question: how can anyone build that fast? As winter turned to early spring in 1945, the war in Europe was entering its final and most desperate phase. The German army was fighting on its own soil now. Cities were in ruins, factories were gutted, rail lines were shattered by Allied air power. Yet German resistance, even in collapse, was fierce. Every crossroads was fortified. Every hill became a defensive position. Every mile cost blood. The Rhine River stood as Germany's last undeniable geographic advantage. Wide, deep, and fast-moving, it cut across the German homeland like a natural moat. To cross it under fire was considered one of the most difficult operations in modern warfare. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt had once said the Rhine was not simply a river, it was a line drawn by fate. If the Allies failed to cross quickly, Germany might hold long enough to negotiate conditions or prolong the conflict by months. American commanders understood the stakes. General Eisenhower pressed forward with urgency. Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group surged through the Rhineland. Courtney Hodges' 1st Army pushed toward key crossing points. The closer the Americans came to the river, the more frantic and destructive the German retreat became. German commanders knew the plan: destroy every bridge. By late February and early March, smoke rose constantly along the Rhine as German demolition teams blew span after span. Stone arches, steel railway bridges, road viaducts, all falling into the current. Each destroyed crossing forced the Americans to halt, bring their engineers forward, and prepare new construction. Which is why what happened at Remagen shocked both sides. Remagen, Germany. 7th of March, 1945, the Ludendorff Bridge had been built during World War I, designed to support rapid military movement along the Rhine. By 1945, it was scarred from bombs and artillery, weakened but still standing. German demolition teams had wired it with explosives and planned to destroy it the moment American forces approached. But there was a problem: time. The U.S. 9th Armored Division moved faster than German defenders expected. Lead elements reached Remagen before final demolition orders were properly coordinated. German officers hesitated, some believing the bridge should be preserved for an orderly retreat. Others demanded it be destroyed immediately. Confusion is a dangerous thing in war. When the Germans finally attempted to blow the charges, the explosives malfunctioned. Only part of the structure was damaged. The bridge remained standing, shaking, listing, but still usable. American scouts stared in disbelief. A bridge across the Rhine, intact. Colonel Leonard Engelmann of the 9th Armored Division radioed command for confirmation. But he didn't wait. The opportunity was too great. Orders were simple and unforgettable. Take the bridge. Infantry sprinted first, followed by combat engineers carrying wire cutters, sandbags, rifles, and courage. German machine guns opened from the far bank. Artillery shells crashed around them. The bridge decking shook with every explosion. Some beams were twisted, some planks were missing, but the Americans kept moving. This was not just a crossing. This was breaking the last door to Germany. When word reached the German High Command that the Americans had taken Remagen Bridge intact, disbelief turned to panic. How could one of the most critical Rhine bridges still be standing? How had demolition teams failed? How could the Americans react so fast? Inside command bunkers, officers reviewed reports that sounded impossible. The Rhine was supposed to slow the Americans. Instead, they were now pouring troops directly across it. And yet, the shock was only beginning. Because the Americans didn't just use the surviving bridge. They reinforced it, stabilized it, defended it, and then built more bridges beside it. Bridges that did not exist that morning. Bridges that would be carrying tanks within days. This was the moment German officers began to understand something they had not truly believed before. The Americans were not just fast. They were faster than German doctrine was designed to even imagine. The river that was supposed to stop an army had instead become the place where the momentum of the war broke open. The crossing at Remagen was not yet the end, but it was the beginning of the end, and the men who made it possible were not tank commanders, pilots, or artillery officers. They were engineers, men who built under fire, men who rebuilt what the enemy destroyed, men who turned rivers into roads, which leads us directly to the next part of this story. Who were these engineers? How did they work with such speed? And why could they build under fire when other armies could not? They were not the soldiers most remembered. They were not the men in the newsreels driving tanks or storming trenches. They did not move with the glamour of fighter pilots or the thunder of artillery brigades. The U.S. Army combat engineers were, to many, simply the men who followed the infantry. But at the Rhine, they were the ones who made victory possible. These men came from sawmills, farms, workshops, steel yards, and railroad crews across America. Many had worked with their hands since childhood. They understood weight, force, timber grain, cold-formed steel, and tension long before the Army gave it language. They weren't chosen for glory. They were chosen for their ability to solve problems faster than chaos could create them. They trained differently from most soldiers. While infantry drilled firing lines and assault maneuvers, engineers drilled process under pressure. Repetition, standardization, muscle memory. Bridge components were learned like vocabulary. Every panel, pin, jack, shoe, and ponton had a name, a weight, and a purpose. When the order came to build, there was no time to figure things out. They had to already know the equipment that made speed possible. The Americans did not rely on improvisation alone. They relied on modular design. The M2 Treadway Bridge was the workhorse. Steel decking sections supported by inflatable or metal pontons, lockable into place like a giant mechanical spine across the water. Engineers could float the pontoons into the river, position them with rope lines or small outboard motors, and then place the steel roadway section by section. The river's current fought them constantly. Frostbitten hands worked bolts and pins while shells landed nearby. But the system never changed. It did not require elite genius, only practiced teamwork. Then there was the Bailey Bridge, a masterpiece of wartime engineering. A bridge made of steel panels that could be carried by men, pinned together with simple hand tools, and built into a span strong enough to support tanks. There were no cranes needed, no welding, no machining on site, just pure manual muscle and knowledge. Where Germany saw a river and believed time could be bought, the United States saw a river and sent trucks full of prefabricated solutions. This was the difference. German commanders expected problems. American engineers arrived with answers already loaded in the trucks. The engineer mindset under fire Yet tools and materials were only half the equation. The other half was courage. To build under fire meant working exposed on open riverbanks, carrying heavy steel in full view of enemy machine guns, feeling the river surge beneath raft foundations, fearing artillery that could hammer a bridge to splinters in seconds. Infantry fought to take ground. Engineers fought to hold possibility open. Any delay could cost the crossing. Any hesitation could strand an entire division. Any failure could trap thousands on the wrong side of the river. That kind of work required a different kind of bravery. Not the adrenaline of a charge, but the steady, controlled courage of a man who keeps his hands moving even when he knows he is being targeted. It was said among engineer units, "If you can build under fire, the army can move. If you stop, the army stops." And the engineers did not stop. Leadership that understood speed. As a weapon American engineer, officers were taught something many German officers were not. Do not wait for ideal conditions. Do not wait for approval. Build anyway. If the first ponton drifted, throw another. If a span cracked, reinforce it. If artillery zeroed the work site, use smoke, shift positions, keep working. The goal was not perfection. The goal was continuity of movement. This mindset, movement above all else, became the core of American operational dominance in 1945. While German officers valued precision and control, American engineers valued speed and adaptability. And war, by 1945, favored the adaptable. The engineers had the knowledge. They had the tools. They had the mindset. But now, at Remagen and along the Rhine, they faced the true test. Could they build faster than the Germans could destroy? The answer to that question would shape the final phase of the war. Which brings us to the moment where everything converged. The race at Remagen. The surviving Ludendorff Bridge. The first crossing into the German heartland. The moment the Americans realized the Ludendorff Bridge was still standing, the war at the Rhine became a race. Not a race of speed alone, but of will. Who could act faster under chaos? The Americans moved first. On March 7, 1945, soldiers of the 9th Armored Division surged toward the bridge. German defenders fired from bunkers on the high slopes overlooking the river. Machine gun bursts cut across the decking. Mortar rounds burst along the shoreline. The bridge trembled under the weight of explosions that had already damaged its structure. Steel beams were twisted, railings torn open, decking splintered. Black smoke drifted from failed demolition charges still smoldering on the trusses. Yet the Americans didn't stop. Infantry crossed first, sprinting along the narrow walkway, heads low, boots hitting every open gap where planks had blown away. Some men slipped, caught themselves, and kept moving. Others fell and were dragged back up by the men behind them. They did not look down at the river. They looked forward, because the far bank was Germany itself, and reaching it meant everything. Behind them came the engineers. They were unarmed except for pistols and carbines. Their mission was not to shoot. Their mission was to save the bridge. They worked as if every second mattered, because it did. If the Ludendorff Bridge collapsed, the opportunity would collapse with it. While infantry fought their way off the far bank, the engineers crawled underneath the roadway on catwalks barely wide enough for one man. They inspected support beams under constant fire, listening for the groaning crack of steel under strain. Some of the demolition charges still hung unexploded beneath the trusses. Engineers cut them loose. Others were too dangerous to remove. So they were sandbagged to contain potential blasts. Every sandbag weighed between 40 and 60 pounds. These men carried hundreds of them, sometimes one at a time, sometimes two. They stacked them while bullets chipped steel inches away. Meanwhile, the Germans regrouped. German counterattack begins word spread up the command chain in minutes. The impossible had happened. The Americans were across the Rhine. Orders came swiftly. Destroy the bridge at all costs. German artillery batteries zeroed the span. Shells exploded on the approaches, throwing smoke and debris into the air. The river churned with shrapnel. German machine guns from the heights fired continuously. At night, German spotters directed fire by muzzle flash and silhouette. Then, the Luftwaffe joined the fight. Fighter bombers dove along the river, dropping bombs directly on the span. Anti-aircraft guns on the American side fired back, tracer rounds stitching across the sky. The bridge shook with every near miss, but it did not fall. Even that was not enough. Germany unleashed one of its final desperate weapons, V-2 rockets. They were imprecise, unpredictable, brutal. They cratered the town. They shook earth and bone. But they did not hit the bridge. The Americans held. But holding was not enough. They needed to reinforce the bridge and build more. Because the Ludendorff bridge could not carry the entire First Army. It was damaged. It was overstressed. It was a miracle. But miracles do not last forever. The race now shifted again. The bridge becomes a lifeline. Engineers began directing traffic across the bridge with strict discipline. Vehicle spacing, weight limits, continuous movement. Every minute the bridge stayed open, more men and equipment crossed into Germany. Infantry units expanded the bridgehead. Tanks followed. Artillery crossed. The foothold grew into a wedge, but the bridge was dying. Its steel expansion joints cracked. The decking sagged. Support beams groaned under the weight of armor. Every day, engineers crawled beneath the structure with welding torches, hydraulic jacks, and cable winches, strengthening joints even as shells fell. Some worked until the heat of their torches ignited their clothing. Others were wounded by shrapnel and returned within hours, bandages wrapped around arms, hands, faces. The work never stopped, because they knew what every man understood now. If the bridge fell before new bridges were built, the crossing might be lost, and so, while they fought to keep the Ludendorff Bridge alive, engineer battalions prepared to build a second bridge, and then a third, along the same stretch of river. The Germans were stunned, not simply because the Americans had taken a bridge, but because the Americans refused to let the moment slip away. They acted not in days, not in a week, but in hours. Everything was happening faster than German doctrine allowed for. This was not just military efficiency. This was momentum as a weapon. The bridge at Remagen had been seized. It had been defended. It had been kept alive under fire. Now came the next challenge, one that would define American engineering in the war. Could new bridges be built before the Ludendorff finally gave out? The answer would leave German officers astonished. The Ludendorff Bridge had given the Americans something almost unimaginable, a bridgehead on the eastern bank of the Rhine. But every officer on the scene understood a harsh truth. The bridge could not last. It had been damaged by demolition charges. It had endured artillery barrages and near-miss bombing runs. Its beams were warped. Its joints shrieked under tension. The river beneath it carried swollen spring currents that pulled relentlessly at its foundations. The engineers did not treat the bridge as a triumph. They treated it as a countdown. The question now was not whether the Americans could reinforce it. The question was whether they could build entirely new bridges fast enough to keep the crossing alive when the Ludendorff failed. There was no time for debate, no time for hesitation, no time to wait for perfect weather, ideal positioning, or structural guarantees. The engineers moved before the smoke had even cleared. The decision to build more bridges, immediately, the order went out to multiple engineer groups. Construct additional Rhine bridges at Remagen. The men selected for this work had already crossed rivers in France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. They knew the process. But the Rhine was different. Wider, faster, deeper, more exposed, and now one of the most heavily observed and shelled waterways in Europe. German artillery observers watched every shoreline movement. German spotters scanned the river for boats. Luftwaffe pilots flew low to scout for bridging points. The engineers didn't flinch. They worked at night. They worked under smoke screens. They worked in mud, sleet, and cold. They worked while shells walked the banks. The first of the new bridges, the ponton treadway engineers began assembling a ponton treadway bridge approximately 1,200 feet upstream from the Ludendorff. The concept was brutally simple. Float inflatable pontoons into the river. Anchor them against the current using ropes and boat crews. Lay steel treadway sections end to end across the pontoons. Link the decking into a continuous roadway. Reinforce until it could support trucks, half-tracks, even tanks. The river surged hard enough to pull boats sideways. The current fought every inch of progress. Men hauling steel sections lost their footing and were almost swept away. But the system was built on repetition. No guesswork, no experimentation. The enemy was not allowed to interrupt the rhythm. German artillery targeted the work site. Engineers threw smoke. Shells tore into the bank. Engineers rotated crews instead of halting work. They finished the bridge in days, not weeks. German officers watching from across the river could not believe what they were seeing. The American engineers were not patching the existing bridge. They were multiplying crossings. The German defense strategy, destroy bridges to slow the enemy, was being erased in real time. For every barrier Germany created, the Americans built a new solution faster than Germany could react. Then came the heavy ponton bridge next. Engineers assembled a heavy ponton bridge designed to support the full weight of armored vehicles. Sherman's tank destroyers, self-propelled artillery. This was a bridge built to deliver war, not just troops. Sections were moved into place under artillery ranging shots. Boat crews rowed pontoons into position, muscles straining against the river. The noise of hammering pins and locking braces echoed up and down the valley. German spotters called in fire. Engineers adjusted, shifted, rebuilt, continued. By the time the heavy ponton was complete, American armor began streaming across. For the German High Command, the reality was devastating. A river that was supposed to stop an army was now a highway. The floating Bailey Bridge. Final proof of American intent. Then came the final, most symbolic bridge, a floating Bailey Bridge, constructed after the Ludendorff finally collapsed on March 17th from cumulative damage. The Bailey Bridge required no cranes, no workshops, no special machining, just trained hands and determined men. Steel panels were carried forward by human chain. Pins were driven home with sledgehammers. Trusses rose like a spine over the river. Piers floated, well braced. Swaying but strong, the Germans launched everything at it. Artillery, aircraft, rockets. But the Americans kept building. It was not heroism in the explosive, dramatic sense. It was heroism in persistence, the kind that outlives fear. German officers' realization. By the time the third bridge was operational, German commanders understood the full truth. The Americans were not winning because of luck, not because of numbers alone, not because of overwhelming firepower. They were winning because of speed. Speed of decision movement, construction adaptation, will. The Germans believed rivers bought time. The Americans built right across that time. And the war began to accelerate. The Rhine had been crossed. Not once, not accidentally, but deliberately, repeatedly, undeniably. Which brings us to the consequences. Not on the river, but across Germany itself. Once the new bridges opened and traffic began to flow, the character of the war in Germany changed almost overnight. What had been a stalemate of defensive lines and measured advances became a forward rush. The Rhine, once regarded as a natural fortress, no longer served as a boundary. Instead, it became a landmark behind the advancing American armies. Tanks rolled across the ponton bridges. Half-tracks and fuel convoys followed. Artillery battalions crossed with their guns. Engineers walked alongside them, exhausted, mud-covered, many of them having worked for days with scarcely more than an hour's sleep at a time. It was not just a tactical crossing. It was a psychological one. German soldiers, many of them young conscripts or wounded veterans recalled to service, had been told the Rhine would hold. It had been described as a line that would give Germany the chance to regroup, reorganize, and possibly negotiate. But now, they watched American armored divisions advance eastward with an ease that seemed unreal. Word spread through German ranks that bridges were being thrown across the river almost faster than they could be destroyed. Rumors circulated that the Americans could build a bridge in a day, and, to many soldiers, it no longer seemed like an exaggeration. German officers were left with no strategic pause to reorganize. There was no longer time to reposition divisions, to reinforce the Ruhr, to form new defensive belts, or to evacuate industrial regions. Momentum had become a weapon, one the Americans wielded with calm precision. The speed of the crossings meant that the German High Command could no longer synchronize defensive planning with actual battlefield reality. Orders were drafted for situations that no longer existed. Units were moved to positions already overrun. Bridges blown miles upstream or downstream did nothing to slow the advance. The war had entered a phase where every form of German planning lagged behind American execution. Meanwhile, the supply flow across the new bridges was relentless. In modern warfare, armies do not advance by courage alone. They advance by fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and food. The American system ensured these flowed continuously, day and night. Fuel convoys crossed the Rhine in disciplined intervals. Maintenance units crossed with mobile workshops. Medical evacuation routes were established on the same day as armored thrusts. Every aspect of movement was practiced, rehearsed, expected. The Germans could not match this. Not in March 1945. Not with factories destroyed, oil scarce, transportation broken, and the sky controlled by American aircraft. At the same time, the presence of multiple bridges allowed American commanders to shift forces rapidly along the front. Divisions could be redeployed to exploit weaknesses before the Germans even recognized them. Small breakthroughs became large ones. Local gains became wide corridors. Entire German formations were encircled, bypassed, or forced to surrender simply because they could not move fast enough to escape. Civilians witnessed something else, something subtle but profound. Where German propaganda had promised strength and protection, they now saw collapse. Where they had been told the Rhine was impenetrable, they now saw American convoys crossing smoothly, efficiently, almost routinely. The psychological effect was shattering. Many towns surrendered without prolonged resistance. Others simply waited silently for the Americans to arrive, knowing the war had already moved past them. The fall of Germany's western defenses was not marked by one single event, not even by the taking of the Ludendorff Bridge itself. It was marked by the realization that the Americans could rebuild faster than Germany could destroy, that every obstacle placed in front of them was not a delay, but simply another task to be worked through. This was not merely engineering, it was will applied through structure, system, and discipline. By the time March turned to April, the Rhine crossing was no longer discussed as a daring success, but as an inevitability, the natural result of a machine that understood time as its greatest ally. The Americans had not just crossed a river, they had crossed into the final act of the war. And now, with the bridges standing firm and the German defenses collapsing ahead, the question was no longer whether the war would end. The question was, how soon? The Rhine was more than a river. It was a line in the mind of Europe, a final barrier, a symbol of a nation's pride and its hope for time. For generations, strategists had spoken of it as the place an invading force would be stopped, slowed, or bled until it broke. In March 1945, that belief dissolved under the weight of something far more decisive than explosives, artillery, or fortifications. It dissolved under the weight of American speed. Not the hurried, frantic pace of desperation, but the disciplined tempo of a force that had prepared long before the moment arrived. The U.S. Army engineers did not win the crossing of the Rhine through improvisation or luck. They won it through planning that began years earlier, in training fields, workshops, classrooms, foundries, and sawmills. They won it through thousands of hands moving with quiet certainty. They won it by understanding that war favors those who act before their enemy can think. German officers watching the new bridges rise could hardly understand what they were seeing. Their doctrine had taught them that destruction delayed pursuit, that rivers bought time. But they were witnessing a new truth. The Americans didn't need existing bridges. They brought their own. The Rhine crossing did not end the war, but it made its end clear. Once the river was behind them, American divisions moved like a tide that could no longer be held back. The German army did not collapse all at once, but the confidence behind its defenses did. The bridge at Remagen eventually fell. The bridges the engineers built remained, and the road they opened led straight to the heart of Germany. When historians look back, they speak of tanks, generals, strategies, and battles. But sometimes, history turns because a group of men, under fire, refused to stop building, and the world changed because of it.